How could a single day encapsulate the entirety of human cruelty? Imagine being chosen, not for survival, not for work, but for the twisted amusement of your captors. This is the story of one woman who lived that nightmare during World War II. The biting Polish wind whipped through the skeletal remains of what was once a thriving village. Now, only husks of homes stood, monuments to the brutal efficiency of the German war machine. Dust devils danced in the deserted streets, swirling around the feet of the occupying soldiers, their heavy boots echoing on the cobblestones, a constant reminder of subjugation. It was late 1944, and winter's icy grip held the land hostage, mirroring the iron grip the Nazis held on its people. The air itself seemed to crackle with fear and despair. Each sunrise brought not hope, but a renewed sentence of oppression. Food was scarce, hope even scarcer. The villagers, once vibrant and full of life, were now gaunt shadows, their eyes hollowed out by hunger and fear. Every day was a struggle for survival, a desperate attempt to cling to the remnants of their humanity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Among these villagers was Zofia, a woman whose spirit, though battered, refused to break. Before the war, she had been a teacher, her days filled with the laughter of children and the promise of a brighter future. Now, her classroom was a memory, replaced by the harsh reality of survival under occupation. Her hands, once used to guide young minds, were now calloused from scavenging for scraps of food and tending to the sick. Zofia lived with her elderly mother in the cramped cellar of their bombed-out home. The cellar offered little protection from the cold, but it was their sanctuary, a place where they could whisper stories of the past and dream of a future free from the Nazi terror. Each morning, Zofia would venture out into the ravaged village, bartering what little possessions they had for food. She navigated the streets with a mixture of fear and determination, always wary of the German patrols that roamed the area. The soldiers were unpredictable, their moods shifting from indifference to sadistic cruelty in an instant. Zofia had learned to make herself invisible, to blend into the background, hoping to avoid their attention. But on this day, her efforts were in vain. The sun, a pale disk in the winter sky, cast long shadows as Zofia walked past the village square, now a makeshift military depot. A group of soldiers stood near a truck, laughing and smoking cigarettes. As she passed, one of them, a burly man with a cruel face, grabbed her arm. His grip was like iron, and Zofia cried out in pain. The other soldiers turned to look, their eyes filled with amusement. The burly soldier dragged Zofia towards the truck, ignoring her pleas. She struggled against his grip, but it was no use. He was too strong. He threw her into the back of the truck, where several other women were already huddled together, their faces pale with fear. Zofia recognized some of them as women from the village. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and resignation. Zofia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what this meant. She had heard the stories, the whispers of what happened to women who were taken by the soldiers. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she closed her eyes, praying for it to be just a nightmare. The truck lurched forward, throwing Zofia against the side. The women huddled closer together, seeking comfort in each other's presence. The truck rumbled along the snow-covered road, leaving the ravaged village behind. Zofia opened her eyes and looked out the back of the truck. The familiar landscape of her homeland was blurred and distorted, a reflection of the terror that gripped her soul. She had no idea where they were being taken, but she knew it wouldn't be good. The soldiers in the front of the truck laughed and shouted, their voices carried on the wind. Zofia closed her eyes again, trying to block out the sounds of her captors. She thought of her mother, alone in the cold cellar. She wondered if she would ever see her again. The truck journeyed for what felt like an eternity, the cold seeping into Zofia's bones. Finally, the truck screeched to a halt. The soldiers jumped out and opened the back of the truck. They motioned for the women to get out. Zofia hesitated, her legs trembling. She didn't want to move, but she knew she had no choice. She climbed out of the truck, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. They were in a large courtyard, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. In the center of the courtyard was a long, wooden building. The building was brightly lit, and Zofia could hear music and laughter coming from inside. A sense of dread washed over her. This was no ordinary military depot. This was something far more sinister. The soldiers herded the women towards the building. As they approached, Zofia could see that the windows were covered with thick curtains. She could hear the muffled sounds of German voices and the clinking of glasses. The soldiers opened the door and pushed the women inside. The room was large and smoky, filled with German soldiers. They were drinking and gambling, their faces flushed with alcohol. A gramophone blared out a jaunty German tune. The soldiers turned to look at the women, their eyes filled with lust and mockery. Zofia felt a wave of disgust wash over her. She wanted to run to escape this nightmare, but she was trapped. This was the place where the Germans had fun with captives, a place where humanity was discarded for cheap entertainment. She was the chosen one for the day, the slave to their amusement. What kind of entertainment awaited her, she couldn't even imagine. Her mind raced, seeking an escape, a way out of this living hell. But there was none. She was trapped, a pawn in their cruel game. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of her despair. Would she survive this day? Would she ever see her mother again? The questions echoed in her mind, unanswered as the soldiers closed in. The soldiers began to make their selections, their eyes scanning the group of terrified women like they were selecting livestock at a market. Zofia tried to make herself as small as possible, hoping to avoid their gaze. She focused on a loose thread on her worn dress, anything to distract herself from the leering faces around her. One by one, the women were chosen, their cries muffled as they were led away. Each selection brought a fresh wave of terror, a stark reminder of Zofia's own impending fate. The air in the room thickened with fear, a palpable sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. Zofia could feel her body trembling, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She closed her eyes, praying for strength, for the courage to face whatever awaited her. A rough hand grabbed her arm and Zofia's eyes snapped open. A young soldier, no older than 20, stood before her, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He looked at her with a strange expression, a flicker of something that might have been pity in his eyes. He gestured for her to follow him, and Zofia reluctantly obeyed. He led her through the crowded room, past the jeering soldiers and the terrified women, towards a back door. Zofia had no idea where he was taking her, but she clung to the faint hope that this young soldier might be different, that he might show her some mercy. The soldier led her down a narrow hallway, past a series of closed doors. The hallway was dimly lit, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Zofia could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and music coming from the main room, a stark contrast to the quiet desperation of the hallway. The soldier stopped in front of one of the doors and took a deep breath. He looked at Zofia, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. A single bed stood against one wall, covered with a worn blanket. A small table sat in the corner with a pitcher of water and a glass. The room was clean and simple, but it offered little comfort. Zofia stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. The soldier followed her in and closed the door behind them. He stood there for a moment, his back against the door as if guarding her. He looked at Zofia, his expression unreadable. "My name is Carl," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to hurt you." Zofia stared at him in disbelief. Was this a trick? Was this some new form of torture? She didn't know what to believe. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Carl looked down at the floor, avoiding her gaze. I can't explain," he said. Just trust me." He walked over to the table and poured a glass of water. He handed it to Zofia. "Drink," he said. "You need it." Zofia hesitated, but she took the glass and drank the water. It was cool and refreshing, and it calmed her nerves slightly. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Carl looked at her, his eyes filled with sadness. "I want to help you," he said, "but I don't know how." He paced around the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "I hate this," he said. "I hate what we're doing here, but I'm just a soldier. I have to follow orders." Zofia watched him, her mind racing. Was this soldier truly trying to help her, or was he just playing a game? She couldn't be sure, but she knew that she had to take a chance. "If you want to help me," she said, "then you have to get me out of here." Carl stopped pacing and looked at her. "I can't do that," he said. "If I tried, they would kill me." "Then what can you do?" Zofia asked, her voice filled with desperation. Carl thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I can give you a day," he said. "A day of peace. A day where you don't have to be afraid." Zofia looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion. "What do you mean?" Carl explained that he had been assigned to entertain her for the day. But he didn't want to treat her like the other soldiers treated their captives. He wanted to give her a day of normalcy, a day where she could forget, for a few hours, the horrors of the war. He would bring her food, talk to her, and protect her from the other soldiers. It was a small act of defiance, a tiny spark of humanity in the midst of unimaginable darkness. Zofia listened to him, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Could this be real? Could this soldier actually be offering her a respite from the nightmare? She didn't know what to think, but she knew that she had nothing to lose. "Okay," she said. "I trust you." Carl smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good," he said. "Then let's start." He spent the day talking to Zofia, sharing stories of his life before the war. He told her about his family, his dreams, and his fears. He brought her food, simple but nourishing fare that filled her empty stomach. He even managed to find a book for her to read, a collection of Polish poetry. Zofia listened to Carl, her heart slowly beginning to heal. She told him about her life as a teacher, about her love for her students, and about her hopes for the future. She shared stories of her mother, her friends, and her village. For a few hours, she was able to forget the war, to escape the horrors that surrounded her. Carl was a good listener, and he seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. He treated her with respect and kindness, a stark contrast to the other soldiers she had encountered. As the day wore on, Zofia began to trust Carl. She realized that he was not like the other soldiers. He was a decent human being, trapped in a terrible situation. But even as she began to trust him, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Was this all a game? Was he just trying to lull her into a false sense of security? She couldn't be sure. But she knew that she had to enjoy this day, this brief respite from the nightmare. As the sun began to set, Carl grew quiet and withdrawn. He seemed to be wrestling with something, his brow furrowed in concentration. Zofia watched him, her heart filled with apprehension. She knew that the day was coming to an end, and she dreaded what would happen next. "What's wrong?" she asked. Carl looked at her, his eyes filled with sadness. "I have to tell you something," he said. "Something that you're not going to like." He hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Tomorrow," he said, "you're going to be transferred." The word transferred hung in the air like a death sentence. Zofia's heart plummeted. Transferred meant only one thing, a fate far worse than anything she had already endured. The whispers she had heard, the rumors of the camps, the unspeakable acts, they all flooded back into her mind. The brief flicker of hope that Carl had ignited was extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of her situation. "Where?" she managed to croak out, her voice barely audible. Carl avoided her gaze, his face etched with guilt. I don't know," he stammered. "But it's not good, it's a work camp." A work camp. The words echoed in Zofia's mind, conjuring images of brutal labor, starvation, and death. She had heard stories of these camps, stories so horrific that she had tried to block them out. But now those stories were her reality. She was being sent to a place where she would be worked to death, a place where her humanity would be stripped away, leaving her a hollow shell. "When?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Tomorrow morning," Carl replied. "They'll be here to pick you up at dawn." Zofia stared at him in disbelief. But you said you wanted to help me," she said. "You said you wouldn't let anything happen to me." Carl looked at her, his eyes filled with despair. "I tried," he said. "I swear I did, but there's nothing I can do. I'm just a soldier. I can't defy orders." Zofia felt a surge of anger, a burning rage that threatened to consume her. "You lied to me," she shouted. "You gave me hope and then you snatched it away." Carl flinched at her words, his face paling. "I didn't lie to you," he said. "I truly wanted to help you, but I'm powerless. I'm just a pawn in this game." Zofia turned away from him, her heart filled with bitterness. She had allowed herself to trust him, to believe in his promises. And now she was paying the price. She walked over to the bed and sat down, her body trembling. She felt numb, devoid of emotion. She had no tears left to cry. Carl watched her, his face filled with remorse. He wanted to say something, to offer some comfort, but he knew that nothing he could say would make a difference. He had failed her. He had given her a day of peace, only to shatter it with the news of her impending doom. He stood there for a moment, then turned and walked towards the door. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." He opened the door and stepped out, leaving Zofia alone in the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing her fate. Zofia sat on the bed for a long time, staring blankly at the wall. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't escape. She couldn't fight back. She was trapped, a prisoner of war at the mercy of her captors. As the night wore on, Zofia began to think about her mother. She imagined her alone in the cold cellar, wondering what had happened to her. She knew that her mother would be devastated by her disappearance. She had to find a way to let her know that she was still alive, that she hadn't forgotten her. But how? She had no paper, no pen, no way to communicate with the outside world. She looked around the room, desperately searching for something, anything, that she could use to send a message. Her eyes fell on the book of Polish poetry that Karl had given her. She picked it up and began to flip through the pages, her mind racing. An idea began to form in her mind, a desperate plan that might just work. She would use the book to send a coded message to her mother, a message that would let her know that she was still alive and where she was being taken. It was a long shot, but it was the only hope she had. She began to carefully examine the poems, searching for words and phrases that she could use to convey her message. It was a painstaking process, but she worked tirelessly, fueled by a desperate determination. As the first rays of dawn began to creep through the window, Zofia finished her message. It was a simple message, but it was enough. It would let her mother know that she was alive and that she was being sent to a work camp. She carefully hid the book under the mattress, hoping that her mother would find it. A loud knock echoed through the room, jolting Zofia from her thoughts. The door swung open and two German soldiers stood there, their faces grim. "Time to go," one of them said, his voice harsh. Zofia stood up, her legs trembling. She took one last look around the room, a room that had offered her a brief respite from the horrors of war. She walked towards the door, her head held high. She would face her fate with courage and dignity, knowing that she had done everything she could to let her mother know that she was still alive. The soldiers led her out of the room and into the courtyard. A truck was waiting there, its engine idling. Several other women were already huddled in the back, their faces pale with fear. Zofia climbed into the truck, her heart pounding in her chest. The truck lurched forward, leaving the village behind. As they drove away, Zofia looked back at the building where she had spent the last day. She saw Karl standing in the doorway, watching them. His face was filled with sadness and regret. Zofia looked away, her heart filled with a mixture of anger and pity. She knew that he had tried to help her, but he had failed. And now she was on her way to a place where she might never return. The truck rumbled onward, each mile carrying Zofia further into the unknown, further away from everything she held dear. The faces of the women around her reflected her own fear and uncertainty. They were a silent sisterhood, bound together by their shared fate. Hours blurred into an eternity as the landscape outside transformed from familiar countryside to a desolate, industrial wasteland. Smoke billowed from towering chimneys, choking the sky with a grimy haze. The air grew thick with the stench of coal and burning metal, a suffocating assault on the senses. Finally, the truck shuddered to a halt before towering gates adorned with barbed wire. The gates opened with a groan, revealing a sprawling complex of barracks, factories, and watchtowers. This was it, the work camp. A wave of despair washed over Zofia. The women were herded out of the truck by guards wielding rifles. The guards barked orders in harsh German, their voices echoing across the compound. Zofia struggled to understand the commands, her heart pounding in her chest. She was pushed and shoved along with the other women, herded like cattle towards a large building. Inside, they were stripped of their clothes, their heads shaved, and their bodies marked with identification numbers. The dehumanization was complete. Zofia stared at her reflection in a cracked mirror, barely recognizing the gaunt, shorn figure staring back at her. She was no longer Zofia, the teacher, the daughter, the friend. She was simply a number, a nameless, faceless entity in the vast machinery of the Nazi regime. They were issued thin, striped uniforms and wooden clogs. The clothes were ill-fitting and scratchy, offering little protection from the cold. The clogs were uncomfortable and made it difficult to walk. Zofia felt like a puppet, her strings controlled by unseen forces. They were led to their barracks, long, crowded rooms filled with bunk beds stacked 3 high. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, dirt, and despair. Zofia found an empty bunk and collapsed onto it, exhausted and defeated. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sights and sounds of the camp. But it was no use. The screams of the tormented, the shouts of the guards, and the ever-present hum of the factory machinery filled her mind. She knew that this was her new reality. This was where she would live, work, and perhaps die. As the days turned into weeks, Zofia learned the brutal rhythms of the camp. She woke before dawn to the sound of the guards' whistles. She ate a meager breakfast of stale bread and watery soup. She worked long hours in the factory, performing backbreaking labor for little or no reward. She endured the constant abuse and humiliation of the guards. She watched as her fellow prisoners succumbed to disease, starvation, and despair. She clung to her memories of the past, her love for her mother, and her hope for a future free from oppression. These were the things that kept her going, the things that prevented her from giving up. One evening, as Zofia was returning to the barracks after a long day of work, she noticed something unusual. A small group of women were huddled together in a corner, whispering furtively. She approached them cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. "What's going on?" she asked. The women looked at her nervously. "We can't tell you," one of them said. "It's too dangerous." "Please," Zofia pleaded. "I need to know. I can't take this anymore." The women hesitated for a moment, then relented. "We're planning an escape," one of them whispered. Zofia stared at them in disbelief. "An escape," she said. "But how? It's impossible." "We have a plan," the woman replied. "We've been digging a tunnel. It's almost finished." Zofia's heart leaped with hope. A tunnel, a chance to escape this hellhole. It seemed too good to be true. "Can I help?" she asked. The women looked at each other, then nodded. "Yes," one of them said. "We need all the help we can get." They explained the plan to Zofia. The tunnel led from the barracks to the outside of the camp. They had been digging it for months, using spoons and scraps of metal. It was a slow, dangerous process, but they were determined to succeed. Zofia joined the group, working tirelessly to help them finish the tunnel. She dug, carried dirt, and kept watch for the guards. The work was exhausting, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a prisoner waiting to die. She was part of something bigger, something that gave her hope. As they neared completion of the tunnel, a new rumor swept through the camp. A selection was coming. The Nazis needed to fill quotas for other camps, and they would be choosing the weakest and sickest prisoners. Fear gripped the women. Zofia knew that if she was selected, she would not survive. The escape tunnel was their only hope, but the timing was growing desperate. As the women finalized their plans to escape, a chilling discovery was made. One of the women in the group had been acting strangely, whispering to guards and disappearing for long periods. Doubt turned to certainty. There was a traitor among them. But who? The question hung over them like a guillotine blade. How could they complete the escape plan if they didn't know whom to trust? The paranoia within the group intensified. Every whispered conversation, every furtive glance became suspect. Zofia found herself doubting everyone, even the women she had come to trust. The fear of betrayal was almost as crippling as the fear of the guards. They decided to proceed with extreme caution. Only a select few would know the final escape date, and those few would be watched closely. The tension was unbearable. The selection loomed. The tunnel was almost complete, and the traitor lurked in their midst. One night, as Zofia was returning to the barracks, she saw one of the women, Helena, slipping away into the shadows. Helena had always been quiet and withdrawn, but lately she had been acting even more strangely. Zofia decided to follow her. She crept through the darkness, keeping Helena in sight. Helena led her to a remote corner of the camp near the fence. There she met with a German guard. Zofia watched in horror as Helena handed the guard a piece of paper. The guard took the paper and smirked. Zofia knew that Helena was the traitor. She had betrayed them all. Zofia confronted Helena, her voice trembling with anger. "You," she hissed. "You're the traitor." Helena's eyes widened in fear. "No," she stammered. "It's not what you think." "I saw you," Zofia said. "I saw you talking to the guard. You betrayed us." Helena burst into tears. "I had no choice," she sobbed. "They threatened to kill my family if I didn't cooperate." Zofia felt a pang of sympathy for Helena, but she knew that she couldn't be trusted. She had endangered them all. "It's too late," Zofia said. "You've already done the damage." She turned and ran back to the barracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to warn the others. But as she reached the barracks, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. The barracks were surrounded by guards. They were searching the building, tearing apart the bunks and interrogating the prisoners. The escape had been discovered. Someone had betrayed them. Zofia knew that it was only a matter of time before she was caught. She had to think fast. She couldn't go back to the barracks. She had to find another way out. She looked around, desperately searching for a place to hide. Her eyes fell on a small shed used for storing tools. It was dark and cramped, but it was her only option. She ran towards the shed and slipped inside just as the guards spotted her. "There she is," one of them shouted. "Stop her." Zofia slammed the door shut and braced herself against it. The guards pounded on the door, trying to break it down. She knew that it wouldn't hold for long. She had to find a way out of the shed. She looked around the small space, her eyes scanning the shelves and bins. She saw shovels, picks, hammers, and saws, but nothing that could help her escape. Then her eyes fell on a pile of burlap sacks. She grabbed one of the sacks and ripped it open. Inside, she found potatoes. She stared at the potatoes for a moment, then a plan began to form in her mind. She grabbed a handful of potatoes and began to hurl them at the window. The potatoes shattered the glass, creating a small opening. She squeezed through the opening, cutting herself on the jagged edges. She landed on the ground outside the shed and ran as fast as she could. The guards were right behind her, firing their rifles. Bullets whizzed past her head. She could feel the heat of the explosions as they hit the ground nearby. She kept running, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew that she had to get away. She ran through the camp, past the barracks, past the factory, past the watchtowers. She was a fugitive, hunted by the Nazis. As she reached the fence, she saw a glimmer of hope. A section of the fence had been damaged, creating a small gap. She squeezed through the gap and found herself outside the camp. She was free, but she was also alone in the middle of nowhere with no food, no water, and no idea where to go. She looked back at the camp, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and despair. She had escaped, but she had left her friends behind, and she knew that they were counting on her to bring help. She turned and ran, determined to survive, determined to bring justice to those who had been left behind. Zofia stumbled through the dense forest, her body aching with exhaustion. The rough terrain tore at her clothes and scratched her skin. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and her throat was parched with thirst. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew that she had to keep moving. She had to find someone who could help her, someone who could lead her to the resistance. Days turned into nights as Zofia wandered through the wilderness. She scavenged for berries and mushrooms, drank from streams, and slept under the stars. She was constantly on the lookout for German patrols, hiding in the bushes whenever she heard the sound of vehicles or footsteps. The forest was a dangerous place, but it was also her sanctuary. It offered her protection from the Nazis and gave her a chance to heal. As she traveled, she thought about the women she had left behind in the camp. She wondered if they were still alive. She wondered if they had been punished for the failed escape. She knew that she had to do everything she could to help them. One day, as Zofia was walking along a dirt road, she saw a group of people approaching in the distance. She hid in the bushes and watched as they drew closer. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but they carried rifles and wore determined expressions on their faces. Zofia realized that they were partisans, members of the Polish resistance. She stepped out of the bushes and approached them cautiously. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling. "I need your help." The partisans stopped and looked at her suspiciously. "Who are you?" one of them asked. "What do you want?" Zofia explained her story, telling them about the work camp, the escape, and the women she had left behind. The partisans listened intently, their faces growing grim. When she had finished, the leader of the group stepped forward. "We know about the camp," he said. "We've been planning an attack for weeks, but we need more information." Zofia offered to help, telling them everything she knew about the camp's layout, the guards' routines, and the location of the tunnel. The partisans were grateful for her information. They knew that it would be invaluable in planning their attack. They welcomed Zofia into their group and gave her food, water, and a place to rest. As she recovered, Zofia began to train with the partisans, learning how to use a rifle and how to fight. She was a quick learner and she soon became a skilled fighter. She was determined to get revenge on the Nazis and to liberate the women in the camp. After weeks of preparation, the partisans launched their attack. They infiltrated the camp under the cover of darkness, taking the guards by surprise. Zofia fought alongside them, her heart filled with fury and determination. They stormed the barracks, freeing the prisoners and leading them to safety. The battle was fierce, but the partisans were well prepared. They overwhelmed the guards and seized control of the camp. As the sun rose, the camp was liberated. The prisoners were free. Zofia searched for her friends, her heart pounding with anticipation. She found them huddled together in a corner, their faces pale and drawn. They rushed to her, embracing her and thanking her for saving them. Zofia was overjoyed to see them. She had fulfilled her promise. She had brought them justice. As the partisans prepared to leave the camp, Zofia made a shocking discovery. Among the captured German officers was Karl, the soldier who had helped her escape. He stood there, his head bowed in shame. Zofia stared at him, her heart filled with conflicting emotions. She was grateful to him for what he had done, but she was also angry at him for his betrayal. He had given her hope only to snatch it away. What would she do? Would she condemn him or offer forgiveness? The question hung in the air, unanswered, a final, agonizing twist in her harrowing tale.